Now I'd like to welcome to the show Emma Camp, associate editor at Reason Magazine and author of the forthcoming book, Good Boundaries, Essays on the Age of Risk-Aversion. Welcome to Free the Economy, Emma.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So your beat at Reason is a pretty fascinating one, I think, covering things like online culture, gender politics, but also higher education, sometimes family law or cancel culture and free speech. Uh, just to start with, how did you end up with a journalism gig in 2025 that lets you write about a bunch of cool topics? Because there was a time a few years ago when people thought all the real journalism jobs were going away and that every young writer would have to just churn out 10 listicles a day for BuzzFeed for the rest of their lives rather than doing actual reporting.
Oh gosh, how I got started in the business is actually a pretty interesting story. So I had been an intern at the Foundation for, it's now called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, then and Education, FIRE, the free speech group. And I had been, vaguely interested in opinion journalism, but being an opinion journalist felt very much like wanting to be an astronaut. Like, that's nice that you want to do that, but it's never going to happen. And so I had these vague ideas of just like getting a PhD in feminist philosophy. And then an editorial assistant at the New York Times shot me an email and said, "Hey, I like your columns in the school paper. You want to pitch an essay for us?" And I went, yes, I would very much like to do that. And 5 months later, that turned into, really, actually, that in and of itself sort of gave me the kick in the pants to be like, okay, maybe I can do this journalism thing. Like whether or not this ends up working out, someone has recognized that I'm good at this.
Right.
And so I applied to a bunch of journalism jobs. The only one that even got back to me was Reason. And so that's how I ended up getting the job at Reason. And then right after I got the job at Reason, I had this op-ed published in the New York Times that went like crazy viral. My first name was trending on Twitter at one point. Barry Weiss's name was trending on Twitter because people were like negatively comparing me to her. And it was like this whole crazy thing. And that sort of um, was my fiery entrance into journalism. And so I've been at Reason ever since, and I love Reason. One of the things I love about Reason is that they kind of let me write about whatever I want. And so sometimes that means writing about like child protective services overreach or student loans. And it also can mean writing about like the latest internet fury inducing essay about like why all of the men are bad.
Hashtag not all men. So we have a lot of great topics to talk about, including hot discourse topics. So it's like capital D TM discourse. As we're recording this, your most recent reason piece is titled "Capitalism Isn't Why You're Unhappy," which is a perfect connection for us because all the way back in episode 30, we had Jeremiah Johnson from Infinite Scroll on here, and we did like a solid 45 minutes on a similar theme. But I love it. So the updated discourse from 2 years later is also excellent. So you wrote. Uh, Capitalism gets conflated with everything from consumerism and government corruption to the concept of work itself. Online anti-capitalism is not so much a reaction against economic reality as a reaction against, well, reality. So how did we end up with this sort of vague general kind of like political economy framework of our modern life being responsible for everything wrong with our life?
Yeah, so in that piece, I essentially am arguing that the reason, like when people are complaining about capitalism online, most of the time they're not making a coherent economic argument. Like there are sometimes when people are complaining about capitalism where like I might disagree with them, but they're at least operating with a good faith understanding of what capitalism is and, maybe some of the downsides, whatever. But most of the time when people are like, oh, I have internalized capitalism or like capitalism why nobody will pick me up and take me to the airport, or capitalism is why I have to be monogamous or whatever. They're clearly not complaining about like a free market system in which goods are distributed by markets rather than governments. They're using capitalism as this all-purpose word to mean like anything they don't like about American life. And I think part of why that is probably the way that being a radical is really cool. And I
Mhm.
think in our current age, being an anti-capitalist radical is part of that.
This is a sort of like the universal solvent for everything that's bad with your life suggests would theoretically suggest that there's something the alternate version would be where everything is good with your life, right? Because if capitalism is actually the reason why everything is bad with your life, surely the opposite of that would create some sort of utopia or near utopia. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of, and I've read a million of these, again, what Jeremiah calls ugh capitalism stories and tweets and
Yeah.
commentary, um, with examples of like you just sort of rattled off there, all these like discontents with contemporary life. But with the exception of, I think, probably like single payer healthcare, where a lot of people would say, oh, our healthcare system sucks. We should have, single payer healthcare. And that would be an actual tangible thing that's better, right? That they can point to that's important. Uh, there's like not a lot of other systems where people say, this thing that I don't like that's caused by capitalism would be so much better in Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea, or even, like
Right.
the
And
supposed, yeah,
yeah, and often sometimes people are saying like, "Oh, it would be so much better." Like there was one video I found where a woman was talking about how much better things are in Spain. But of course, like the Spanish youth unemployment rate is something like 20 or 30%. It's really high. And so like what I think a lot of people are fundamentally complaining about is like the state of having to work at all and like having to work under circumstances where they don't have much going on after they clock out. Like these complaints about work show up over and over and over, but they're sort of grounded in this fundamentally false belief that like capitalism invented work itself. There was a viral Twitter thread in 2020 that was basically like, what are you doing on the communist compound? I'm going to be writing poetry and brewing lattes. And it was full of these people who are like, yeah, I'm going to be giving like radical theory lessons and, making art. And no one was like, I'm going to be digging, ditches and cleaning latrines. When in fact, like that's very much what happened under communism. So there's this belief that like in a world without capitalism, you can basically live a life of pure leisure, which is not grounded in reality or grounded in like any non-capitalist way of orienting society that has come before.
well, yeah, even doctrinaire Marxism tends to put a pretty high emphasis on labor, right? Labor is really at the center of traditional socialist thought, right? The idea that everyone is a laborer, that everyone has to work, that everyone has to contribute to society, that in fact labor is at the very centerpiece of almost all Marxist theory about how society would work. This sort of like I'm going to be a part-time astrologer on the commune and yet enjoy a sort of like middle class first world life is even left-wing ideologues have not really suggested that that would be possible.
Right. I mean, and that's why I think most of the time when people are complaining about capitalism online, it isn't that they're like stupid socialists making stupid socialist arguments. It's that they're using the language that they see other people using to complain about their lives. And I think the fundamental problem here is loneliness and a lack of meaning. And that's kind of what everyone is talking about right now. But I think that like if you are working, a not particularly interesting 9 to 5 job, and I think something that's important here is like I am very much anti sort of workism or, very tying your whole identity to your job because I just don't think that's going to work out for most people. Like I have a 99th percentile interesting job
Mhm.
and I still get way more emotionally out of like having a fulfilling marriage and a fulfilling social life than I do my job. And for most people, even most people who are college educated, like, working at an insurance company or being a coder somewhere is just not that intrinsically interesting. And so when we tell people like the way you're going to find fulfillment in your life is your job, we're really setting them up for disappointment.
Yeah, and of course there's plenty of people who have sort of what probably a lot of people would consider boring 9 to 5 jobs who do have kind of amazing, fun, fulfilling things on the side. Like speaking of working in an insurance company, Wallace Stevens was one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and he was an insurance executive for like 30 years. So it's probably you can have it all. Um, but I think what you're getting to, I think, is really interesting, which is that people are complaining about something that on the surface is about economics, but it's really about meaning and sort of happiness. And I'm a pretty free market guy, free markets and small government, and I'm sure most people at Reason are as well. But I'm also kind of a political realist, and I understand that most people, and if you want to get really specific, most swing voters, for example, don't really have a comprehensive political ideology that they filter everything through, right? They're not sort of doctrinaire anythings left or right or whatever. Most people just want society to work and they want basic institutions to function. So they would like there to be things like housing and education and transportation and healthcare and for them to be affordable and all that. Um, but the other thing they want, besides those kind of obvious kind of economic things, is relationships and families. And I think we've seen a lot of negative news in recent years about younger adults, not getting married and not forming stable relationships at the same rates as previous generations. And so, the question all comes, is that, you know, how is this, is this sort of spilling over to politics? And are people changing their like political allegiance or voting, trying to get this thing that politics ultimately is not capable of giving them?
Yeah, I think that's a major factor because I think what's happening is when you can blame capitalism, you're blaming a shadowy force outside of your control. You're basically saying like the reason why I'm unhappy, why I'm dissatisfied is not my fault. And it sounds a little harsh, but like I do actually think a big part of the loneliness epidemic is because people are choosing the easier but lonelier path. It is hard to go to a party where you don't know anybody. It's hard to like go to the dorky adult kickball league or like go to a religious service where you don't know anybody. It's hard to approach somebody at a bar. Like it's difficult. It's difficult to make new friends after you leave college, but it's a thing that you have to do if you want to have a healthy social life full of social connections. It's also hard to admit that you have romantic feelings for someone, and that's necessary if you want to find love. And so I think that like a lot of the blaming things on capitalism comes from people being uncomfortable with their own agency. And the fact that like our beautiful big capitalist world gives people quite a lot of agency about what direction they take their lives and what they do with it. And when, things haven't turned out how they planned, it's really hard to say like, I made bad choices or I wasn't, I'm inadequate in this way. Like that's really psychologically difficult for everybody. And so I think finding some outside force to blame for what's going on is really important for a lot of people. Because I think most of the people making these kinds of arguments are themselves like the downwardly mobile children of the upper middle class. I'm sure some of them are like genuine poor people, but most of the kinds of just based on the way that people are talking, the clothes that they're wearing, the backgrounds, like most of these people are making these videos are manifestly college educated. And I was sold this bill of goods that as long as I went to college and I graduated, I would be able to have the life of my dreams. And that hasn't worked out.
And I wonder, so, this people talked about this effect a lot, whereas in an earlier era, most people would have just compared themselves to other people in their same town, their same city, their same college class, their same high school class. But now we see everyone's fake Instagram dreams constantly all the time, right? You can scroll through and you can see everyone jetting around the world and going, staying in an overwater villa in the Maldives and, living luxury lifestyles and being rich kids of Instagram and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of people end up comparing themselves to that, a lot of which, so one, you're comparing yourselves to sort of like maybe, wealthier, more privileged people that are living a life you don't have access to, but also half of that is kind of fake anyway, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
influencers who try to look, fancier than they really are. Um, and so, but because we have access to all of that in an instant, whereas 30 years ago, we just had, lifestyles of the rich and famous on television once a week, and that was it, right? Is that causing some of this sort of discontent where we sort of feel that everyone is happier and more successful than us, and it's just that all of that stuff gets filtered into sort of the undiluted feed, whereas in a previous generation we would only occasionally see that stuff.
Oh, surely. I definitely think there is a consumerism element of this. And like as I have said in the piece, consumerism is not capitalism. There are lots of things that are bad about like pinning your happiness on material goods. And so I think, yes, there is you see people who are doing, giant shopping hauls or who have, nicer, better clothes than you. This is certainly true when it comes to physical appearance. I think that for a lot of people, both men and women, but for young women especially, like when you feel, like if I just see people walking down the street, I see people that look all various ways, but I rarely see someone where I'm like, oh my goodness, that person is like drop dead gorgeous. But if I open Instagram, it is full of women who are drop dead gorgeous because that's why they're on Instagram, because they're models. But if most of your interaction with other people is seeing these women that are like, their whole job is being beautiful, and then you look at yourself and you're like, well, I look nothing like that. I must be this like ugly hag who needs to stay in my cave lest I turn people to stone. When in fact you're totally normal looking. And I do think that has a real negative impact on a lot of people's senses of self.
Yeah. Also equivalent, guys looking at other guys like Jim Gaines.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
like,
for
oh, my calves are so skinny. What am I going to do? Terrible. Um,
sure.
so, this brings us directly into the hottest topic of all, gender and relationship discourse per se. And just, I'm just going to set you up with a real brief question. For us, if you're a young, successful man out there, who should that man be looking to marry? Should he marry a Waffle House waitress or a girl boss? Because those are the two options.
Well, based on the data, he's going to marry the girl boss. Yes. So there's been this like long-term meme sort of on the online right that any successful man would rather marry a hot 22-year-old Waffle House waitress than some, you know, bitch 35-year-old lawyer girl boss. And I think a lot of it is just like, I mean, I can get into the various causes, but that construction is just manifestly untrue in the data, and it is obvious to anybody who lives in the real world, which is that people tend to want to marry someone whom they like and whom they have a friendship with and a partnership with and come from most of the time like a similar educational or class background from, which is why so many people used to and still do. I met my husband in my first week of college, meet their partners in education or at work. So yes, most wealthy men want to marry a woman who is of a similar education level to them, and that is a no-brainer. But a certain kind of hyper online right has this belief. And I think part of it comes from the idea that they don't like women very much. And they couldn't imagine that a man would want to like select in a female partner anything but pure sexual attractiveness. That like a man would want a woman who's like a similar age to him and, who like has an interesting job that they can talk about or like that they share interests with when he could get like a smoking hot 22-year-old with a GED. And that just isn't true because most men, I think, like women. Maybe that's also a gender discourse hot take that I think most men tend to.
But the battle of the sexes results sometimes in ostensibly heterosexual people seeming to not actually like the opposite sex that
Yes.
much. It does remind me of I was at one of the annual dinners of the Independent Women's Forum. Their big sort of awards gala, and I think it was Heather Higgins who was saying she was about to give an award to a man in that case. Uh, and she said, "Yes, well, we're the women's organization that actually likes men." And then, of course, a knowing ripple of laughter went through the audience. Um, so hard pivot here because we cover all the hot topics, and
Yes.
as of course including questions about artificial intelligence and the future of civilization, such as, for example, our recent episode 131 episode where me and Corbin Barthold from Tech Freedom talked about AI. So you've delved into this and in the sort of like education angle recently, which I think is really interesting. And so there's been a lot of, again, discourse of a slightly different topic about college students using AI and there's supposedly an epidemic of AI cheating on papers and stuff. Um, and so some people have said the crankier older people are like, these kids, they're all lazy today. Gen Zoomers are all lazy. And some people have said, well, maybe it's the professors who are lazy. Maybe they need to be doing more in-class exams or whatever. Um, but maybe some of the students who are cheating with AI shouldn't be in college at all? Question mark.
Yes. So one of my big hobby horses in the education world is that we are admitting way too many students into universities who, based on their test scores and based on their grades, have no business being there. And I mean this in a way like it is actively harmful to them to let them go to college. Like if someone has an SAT score that indicates that they have a fifth grade reading level, accepting them into a university means that they will almost certainly not graduate. This is how you get the schools that have like 90% acceptance rates and like 30% 6-year graduation rates. That student is very unlikely to be able to academically hack it. They're likely to drop out, and that makes that student worse off because if you have some college but no degree, your income is not, it is basically the same as if you had never gone to college at all, but now you have student loan debt. And so it is actively harmful to admit those students into universities. And I think those are students that are quite likely to use AI to make up for their academic insufficiencies. And either way, like if that student maybe needs some academic remediation and could eventually go to college, that's what community college is for. And then my other half of the should not go to college is that college is often just this like meaningless credentialing exercise for a lot of people. There are many, many jobs for which you do not need a college degree. Like if you can code well enough to succeed in some kind of like entry level coding position. This shows you how much I know about math that I'm describing it in these vague terms.
Mhm.
You should be able to do that with journalism, right? If you can write well enough to write a coherent, piece of journalism, like everything I know about journalism, I learned on the job. Like, when do I call somebody for comment? How do I do an interview? What is tape a call? All these things. I just asked my boss in my first couple months at Reason, and she told me. Like, I enjoyed going to college. I'm glad I went to college, but I don't think a college degree was strictly necessary to do that job. And so I think another chunk of students that are likely to use AI are ones that don't really feel like they're getting anything out of their college education. They don't really feel as though they need to be educated. And they're mostly there just to get the stamp that lets them do the job that they really want to do. And I'm like, okay, if you don't feel like you're going to get anything out of this and you have the skills to succeed without it, why don't we just not waste everybody's time and money?
Well, yeah, I think this kind of goes back to we did I think it's episode 48 with Preston Cooper, who's done a bunch of research on ROI on college degrees in colleges about
Yes.
which
Yes.
degree programs will not actually sort of pay you back for the money invested, whether it's yours or it's borrowed or it's your parents. And the most important, I feel like the most important takeaway from that research is not which school necessarily has the best ROI, although you might want to look at that if you're making a specific choice, but just the fact that there's a giant range. And a lot of these colleges and degree programs have very low ROI, and some have very high, right? Like the master's degree in mechanical engineering from
Yeah.
Texas Tech that will set you up. The like film directing masters from NYU will not. That's not
Right. And even this
that's $100,000 down the drain.
schools. Like this is I was an English major at UVA, and of course it can be easy to say, oh, English major, like that's so useless. But the ROI on that at UVA is almost $1 million. Whereas an English major at a smaller school with a 90% acceptance rate is possibly negative. And so it really depends on where you're going and what you're doing. And yeah, like that's exactly my point. Like if you are in a lot of times, like what makes these programs negative ROI is that so many students drop out.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, and Preston said this when we were talking back in this episode, uh, that there's sort of not that most people are like running the numbers on this, but kind of in the back of their mind, they think, well, if college is better than not college, then some college is better than zero college, right? And that seems sort of intuitive that maybe 2 years of college is better than zero. But if you have no degree and you have $50,000 in student loan debt, then that is definitely not better.
So it is definitely not better. And of course, like what is happening in our K-12 education system that so many students are so ill prepared for higher education. Why aren't we invest? And also like even in the best of circumstances, there are going to be plenty of people who just don't want to do who don't want to be in school until they're 22 and could actually have like a flourishing career doing some kind of technical work. And like we have very much underinvested in our public education system in these kinds of hands-on technical programs that could get students into, everybody's talking about how you should be a plumber or an electrician, but stuff like that. And shuttling everybody into higher education, whether or not they're going to get anything out of it, whether or not it's going to actually be worth their money, has not made people better off.
Yeah, we've got an elite overproduction problem. I think that could be a whole hour
Yes,
long.
and that's where you get everybody blaming things on capitalism because we did some elite overproduction, and the person with an English degree from NYU and $100,000 in student loan debt is not going to make as much money as her parents did, and there's a lot of resentment there.
She should get an Instagram. Um, so if we go a few years down the development ladder from college students to high school, junior high, teens and tween students, uh, again, the sort of influence or sort of cross point between education and development and technology. Uh, Again, one of the big trends of the past few years is people saying younger kids, tweens, early teens, the reason why they're having all their problems, whatever problems they are having, and there's some debate about exactly what problems they are. It's technology, it's smartphones, it's 12-year-olds getting on apps they shouldn't be on. That's the problem. You know, when I was growing up, everyone was worried about drug use, teen pregnancy, alcohol use, and all of those things are way down. And I was talking to someone my age who has kids of her own, and I said, "Isn't it so great when we were in high school? All these things that conservatives especially complained about, right? All the low morals, and our drug and alcohol use, all of those things are way down. Isn't it so much better today?" And of course, I should have known better than to get overconfident with someone who actually has young children. And she's like, "Well, yes, but the suicide rate is up
Yeah.
for teens and tweens, and that's way worse." And so of course, I felt bad. I said, "Yes, of course, that's very serious." But because that's one of the things that parents are most worried about because some of the other older worries have declined. That obviously means people are taking this very seriously, and so you have people like Jonathan Haidt, for example, has gotten a lot of ink for saying the number one thing you can do if you have a kid, don't give them a smartphone. Steal, slap it out of their hands. Do not let them on smartphones. Don't let them have an iPhone until they're 18. Is he right?
Ooh, see, as someone with zero children myself, I am cautious to get into here is what parents should do world. I will say to your point about in the past, we were concerned about drug and alcohol abuse and teen pregnancy and things like that. Um, I think part of, and this is why the subtitle of my book is about the age of risk aversion, on the one hand, we have had these dramatic decreases in the really dangerous kinds of risk taking that get teenagers injured or killed. And it's really, really bad stuff like drug and alcohol abuse and teen pregnancy and
Drunk
a whole
driving.
petty crime, drunk driving. Yes, bad, 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 bad things. But what's happening is those things didn't decrease while keeping the good parts of risk aversion. Like teenagers aren't, drinking soda instead of beer at college parties. They're just not going to parties at all. And at the same time, we're having also these like other negative side effects of that less social world, as in increases in the suicide rate, increases in non-suicidal self-harm, that indicate that like the kinds of risk taking that teenagers take when they're having a really good time socially, like, they're drunk driving because they went to a party or they broke their arm because they were doing dumb stuff with a bunch of their buddies. Like that stuff went away. But that meant that now we're just having a lot of teenagers spending time alone, scrolling on their phones, giving themselves TikTok mental illnesses, and that's also bad. I'm not sure if I want to say like therefore we should go back exactly to the way things were because there were good reasons why people were concerned about those outcomes for teenagers. And so I think what we need to figure out is it possible to have a middle ground? Can we get teenagers to do and young people, right? And anybody to do the good kinds of risk taking while staying away from the bad kinds of risk taking. And I'm not so sure. That's something I'm obviously thinking about, but I like to think of myself as more of an observer than a here is what you, parent of small children, should do. I certainly am not optimistic about smartphone use in kids. For me personally, I was a voracious reader my whole childhood. And then in middle school, my parents got me an iPod Touch for Christmas, and I stopped reading for fun and watching YouTube. And like that seems bad. And then there's not to mention like a whole host of other harms that can happen if you get addicted to social media. So I don't know. a little skeptical that small kids should be spending like 8 hours a day on TikTok. That seems bad. Video games seem not quite as bad because they're more social and they require more attention. You're not just scrolling. In the same way that I think I also watched a lot of TV as a kid, and I think that was basically fine. I think TV is probably better than TikTok because you're actually focusing on something for half an hour at a time rather than every couple seconds. But yeah, I don't know. I don't envy parents who have to make that decision right now.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the most unsatisfying answers, certainly if you're a parent who actually is looking for advice, because we're reticent to force advice on parents, especially if we don't have children. But of course, there are plenty of parents who are very much seeking advice, who would like it if they thought it was decent. Um, is that the sort of the unsatisfying answer is that, well, we don't know yet, and so we need more data. Someone, specifically, what are the long-term effects on uh, tweens of, cell phone use? Um, Obviously, again, people like Jonathan and I think the data is like long since in. They think that the case is basically closed on that, but there's plenty of people who do not agree with them. And so we have now a sort of counter movement where some schools, some are private schools, and I'm sure must be some public schools somewhere where they have a local policy on this, where people, educators, teachers, superintendents, uh, have been convinced of this, and they are banning phones from day-to-day classroom use, at least in schools. And so, but because that is only sort of just started, we don't have any sort of like long-term sociological data on what the impacts of that are. But I think if you had a school, especially say if you have like either a middle school or a high school, that's either 2 or 4 years. Once you have a policy for 4 years, everyone, all the students have gone through it, and the school has sort of already been reoriented, right? Even though the all the
Yeah.
adults have been there for multiple years. So you have a whole different, you've sort of created a new environment just because of the throughput of students. And I think that can be measured, but you need people who have the study and actually do it.
Yeah, I mean, I I think the risks of banning smartphones in schools are relatively low, and I'm inclined to support that very strongly. And I think part of it is that we know what's happening when kids have phones in their classrooms, which is that teachers are reporting they're less likely to focus. They're watching TikTok on their phones during class. They're not paying attention. They're doing these like bullying campaigns via their phones. But we also know fairly recently what it was like when kids did not have phones in the classroom. Like when I would say that everyone I knew started getting a smartphone in my like late middle school, early high school. So like when I was in sixth grade, my first phone was not a smartphone. It was like just a little flip phone. And so when I was in very early middle school, late elementary school, most kids I knew either didn't have phones or if they did, it was like a flip phone. So that way they could call their mom to pick them up. And like I don't have I can't say like and things are so much better, but I'm sure many educators who are still teaching in the classroom today were around in like the early 2010s before all of the middle schoolers had phones, and they know what that was like, and they
Mhm.
can compare that to now. And so I'm inclined to basically say like prove smartphones aren't bad for kids rather than prove that they are bad. Like assume that they're probably not great until proven otherwise. And that doesn't necessarily mean I think that like the state should be banning phones for kids, but like but I don't think that it is contra to libertarianism for a local school board to say, as the local school board, here is the thing we are not going to allow in the classroom. Like, I don't know, is it anti-libertarian to say kids shouldn't bring like remote control cars into the classroom or no other pieces of technology? I think they shouldn't bring like TVs into the classroom,
Mhm.
and just as a pure sort of educational philosophy of things that I'm drawn to, I think the move to put a bunch of technology in the classroom is a bad idea. Like I was in school during the push to like all of a sudden none of our teachers had whiteboards anymore. They all had smart boards, and there was bring your own device, and suddenly like every classroom everybody had a laptop. And I do think it affected my ability to focus a little bit. I don't know. That's something that I feel like some libertarians are hesitant to say because to them it sort of opens the door to like banning technology. But
Right.
I think that we can say the state shouldn't intervene here, but like there are negative consequences. Like I don't know. I think it's pretty hard to deny that this sort of instant gratification, short form content impacts people's attention spans.
Well, yeah, and we have, more diversity in educational choices than ever before, which means we also have a series of natural experiments happening between, on all sorts of angles, but including things like smartphones, using smartphones in instruction, using or going to uh, the the really old-fashioned version, which is, we're going to have a school, we're going to have a micro school, we're going to have a charter school where there is no technology, right? We're not even going to wheel in the VHS player with the CRT TV like I had, right? Everything is going to be books
Right.
and lectures, and everything else is banned, and that's fine. That's allowed.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I'm sort of a school choice maximalist. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Like, I have my views, but like, should I really decide how other people's kids get educated? Like, this is why, if you're a parent, you should be able to decide, like, yes, I want my kid to be in the technology maximalism classroom, or no, I want them to be in like the Waldorf school where it's nothing but chalkboards and colored pencils until they're like 17. And it's like, yeah, you make those decisions for your kids. And, it all works out, hopefully.
Uh, well, at least you got no one else to blame. Uh, Emma, this has been an excellent conversation and exciting, lively, many topics to potentially return to. But before we go, tell people about this fantastic book you've got coming out.
Yes, so I'm working on a collection of essays loosely grouped around the concept of risk aversion. And so my thesis is that a lot of the problems that young people, but I also think people broadly in this country are facing come down to risk aversion. But there are these paradoxes. So we're fleeing something with risk aversion, but we end up getting more of it. So an example is basically with romance, right? We're fleeing romantic rejection. We don't want to catch feelings. We don't want to be sort of caught having these strong emotions. But in fleeing, just saying what we think, we get more heartbreak because you can't actually escape risk when it comes to romance. So we just get heartbreak and it hurts even more.
Right.
Or with mental health, like we're fleeing to therapy culture out of risk aversion because it's quite hard to admit, like, maybe my problem isn't about like an identity feature within me. Maybe I'm not fundamentally depressed. Maybe my life sucks in some ways that I can perhaps control. And by fleeing to these maxims that also therapy culture very much emphasizes, other people are the problem, right? Cut off people who test your peace. We end up making ourselves lonely and more isolated. And so it should be coming out spring, summer 2027. And I'm excited to share with everybody. Right now, I'm in the process of actually writing it. So I'm sort of in the trenches at the moment.
All right, fantastic. Well, we can't wait till the trench warfare is done and we can all go to your book party because people should be going to more parties. I've heard that from
Yes,
someone.
yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. If I can get on my soapbox, I am an ideological party thrower. If I have a political allegiance to anything, it is parties. So everybody should throw more parties. Perhaps you should throw one this very weekend. Perhaps.
Excellent. Oh, that's the new, forget the Democratic and Republican parties. It's now the party party.
It's yes, yes. Please nominate me for president of the party party.
All right. And so before we sign off, tell people where they can find all your stuff online.
You can find me on X. You can find me on Instagram. Because I got on those platforms later than everybody else because I was born in 1999. My screen name is really complicated and terrible, and it involves like three M's. So just look up Emma Camp and you'll find me.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much for being with us, Emma.
All right, thank you.